The wind howled like a dying animal through the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains. Below the timberline, a woman lay half-buried in the relentless snow, left to freeze by the man she was supposed to marry. But the mountain didn't claim her. Its most feared phantom did. The Idaho Territory, in the winter of 1883, was an unforgiving expanse of jagged stone and whispering pines. It was not a place for a lady of high society, and it was certainly not a place to be left alone as the sun dipped behind the western ridge, dragging the temperature down into a lethal, bone-cracking chill. Abigail Prescott stumbled through knee-deep drifts, her breath tearing from her lungs in ragged white plumes. Her hands, devoid of gloves, were already turning a terrifying shade of pale blue. She wore only a tailored velvet traveling gown and a thin wool shawl, garments meant for a heated parlor in San Francisco, not the savage altitudes of the Bitterroot Range. Hours earlier, she had been sitting in a private stagecoach beside Arthur Pendleton, her fiancé, and the chief financial officer of her father's sprawling enterprise, the Prescott Mining Company. They were supposed to be traveling to the new silver claim near the town of Wallace, but the journey had been a meticulously orchestrated lie. Abigail had made a fatal error 3 nights prior. She had opened Arthur's private leather satchel and discovered the forged ledgers. Arthur wasn't just embezzling from her father. He was bankrupting the company and funding a hostile takeover with the help of a rival syndicate in Chicago. When she confronted him during the remote mountain pass crossing, Arthur didn't panic. He simply smiled, a cold, empty expression she would never forget. He ordered the driver to halt at gunpoint, dragged Abigail from the carriage, and left her standing in the snow. "Your father's empire needs a visionary, Abigail," Arthur had whispered, buttoning his thick fur coat. "You were merely the ink on the deed, a tragic carriage accident on a dangerous pass. They will mourn you for a season, and then I will inherit it all." Now, the memory of his carriage rolling away was fading, replaced by the overwhelming, numbing embrace of hypothermia. Abigail fell, her frozen hands unable to break the impact. The snow tasted like iron and dirt. Her vision blurred at the edges, the towering pines swaying like dark sentinels in the gathering twilight. She closed her eyes, the biting pain in her extremities giving way to a dangerous, deceptive warmth. A mile up the ridge, Gideon Cole was tracking a wounded elk. Standing 6 feet and 5 inches tall, with shoulders as broad as a cabin door, Gideon was a man carved from the very wilderness he inhabited. Clad in a heavy coat of stitched bear hide and worn leather, his face was obscured by a thick, dark beard and a jagged scar that ran from his left temple down to his jaw, a brutal souvenir from the Battle of Antietam. For 10 years, he had lived in self-imposed exile, trading the blood-soaked battlefields of the East for the silent, indifferent purity of the Western Mountains. To the miners and townsfolk down in Wallace, he was a myth, a wild savage they called the Mountain Ghost. Gideon paused, his sharp eyes catching an anomaly in the snow-covered valley below. It wasn't the elk. It was a patch of dark crimson velvet, stark against the unbroken white canvas. Moving with a silent grace that defied his massive frame, Gideon descended the steep incline. When he reached the shape, his heart, hardened by years of isolation, gave a sudden lurch. It was a woman. She was curled into a tight ball, her face pale as porcelain, her lips tinged with frost. Gideon dropped to his knees, stripping off his heavy fur gauntlets. He pressed 2 thick, calloused fingers against the hollow of her throat. The pulse was there, faint, erratic, like the heartbeat of a dying bird. "Lord Almighty," Gideon murmured, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that hadn't been used for conversation in months. He didn't hesitate. Working quickly, he unclasped his massive bear-hide coat and wrapped it tightly around her fragile form. He scooped her into his arms, as effortlessly as one might lift a child. The wind roared, biting through his wool flannel shirt, but Gideon ignored the cold. He had a 3-mile trek back to his cabin at the edge of Whisper Ridge, and he knew that every passing minute was a drop of life draining from the woman in his arms. The journey was brutal. The snowstorm intensified into a blinding squall, but Gideon navigated the treacherous terrain by memory and instinct. When he finally kicked open the heavy oak door of his cabin, the hearth was still radiating a low, ambient heat from the morning's embers. He laid Abigail gently on his bed, a sturdy frame covered in thick elk and wolf pelts. He stoked the fire until it roared, filling the small timbered room with glorious heat. Knowing she would die if she remained in the frozen, wet velvet, Gideon kept his eyes averted as best as he could while he cut the ruined fabric away with his hunting knife, wrapping her shivering body in his thickest, driest wool blankets. For 3 days and 3 nights, Abigail hovered on the razor's edge between life and death. Gideon rarely slept. He forced warm willowbark tea and rich venison broth past her lips drop by drop. He tended to her frost-bitten fingers with a salve made from pine resin and bear fat, his massive, scarred hands moving with a shocking, meticulous tenderness. In her fever dreams, she thrashed and cried out, begging Arthur to spare her father, weeping for a life that had been brutally stolen. Gideon sat by the fire, whittling a piece of cedar, listening to the tragic fragments of her story. He had come to the mountains to escape the cruelty of men. But as he looked at the fragile, beautiful woman sleeping in his bed, he realized that cruelty had followed him all the way to the timberline. On the morning of the 4th day, the fever finally broke. Abigail slowly opened her eyes. The world was a hazy mix of rough-hewn logs, the smell of wood smoke, and the crackle of a warm hearth. She was buried under a mountain of heavy pelts. For a fleeting moment, she thought she was safe in her bedroom in San Francisco. Then she tried to move her fingers, and a dull, aching stiffness reminded her of the icy hell she had endured. She turned her head and gasped. Sitting at a heavy wooden table across the room was a giant. The man was colossal, his broad back facing her as he meticulously oiled a lever-action Winchester rifle. His hair was long and dark, and his clothes were the rough hides of wild animals. Panic seized Abigail's chest. She remembered Arthur's betrayal, the freezing snow, and now had she been claimed by some feral mountain outlaw. She tried to push herself up, but a weak whimper escaped her dry lips. The giant froze. He slowly set the rifle down and turned. When Abigail saw his face, the severe, rugged lines and the jagged scar, she shrank back against the headboard, pulling the furs up to her chin. "Don't come any closer," she croaked, her voice raspy and broken. Gideon didn't take a step. He remained by the table, holding his large hands up with his palms open, a universal gesture of surrender. When he spoke, his voice was surprisingly soft, carrying a calm cadence that instantly clashed with his terrifying appearance. "You're safe, miss. I ain't going to hurt you," Gideon said. "You took in a lot of cold. You need to lie still, else your lungs might fill with fluid." Abigail stared at him, her chest heaving. Where am I? Who are you?" "My name is Gideon Cole. You're in my cabin, up on Whisper Ridge. Found you 3 days ago, half buried in a drift, down by the old logging trail." "You were nearly gone." The memories hit Abigail like a physical blow. Arthur, the stagecoach, the cold. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over her cheeks as the profound reality of her survival washed over her. She buried her face in her hands, weeping not just for herself, but for her father, who was completely unaware of the viper he had welcomed into his inner circle. Gideon moved then, pouring a cup of hot water from a kettle over the fire. He walked over slowly, giving her time to adjust to his looming presence, and set the tin cup on a small stool beside the bed. "Drink," he urged gently. "It'll soothe your throat." Over the next 2 days, Abigail recovered her strength, and the initial terror she felt toward Gideon morphed into a deep, abiding gratitude. She watched him chop wood with effortless, terrifying power, yet saw how carefully he handled the small, injured snowshoe hare he kept in a pen near the porch. He was a man of severe contrasts, capable of immense violence, yet choosing a life of quiet peace. On her 3rd evening awake, sitting by the fire wrapped in a giant wool sweater Gideon had lent her, Abigail finally told him everything. She spoke of the Prescott Mining Company, the forged ledgers, and Arthur Pendleton's cold-blooded betrayal. "He needs me dead, Gideon," Abigail said, her voice trembling but resolute. If I am alive, his claim to the company and his partnership with the Chicago Syndicate falls apart. He'll tell the world I died in a tragic accident, or perhaps that I was taken by outlaws." Gideon stared into the flames, his jaw tight. "Men like that, they don't leave things to chance, Miss Prescott. If he's as smart and ruthless as you say, he won't just trust the snow to do his killing." Gideon's instincts, honed by war and the wilderness, were dead right. Down in the bustling, muddy streets of Wallace, Arthur Pendleton sat in the private parlor of the Silver Strike Saloon, nursing a glass of expensive bourbon. Across from him sat the Caldwell brothers, Harlan and Boyd. They were notorious trackers and former bounty hunters, men who made their living doing the dirty work the local marshals refused to touch. "The story is simple," Arthur said, sliding a heavy leather pouch across the table. It clinked with the undeniable sound of gold eagles. "My beloved fiancée, Abigail, wandered off from our carriage in a state of hysteria during the storm. I am heartbroken." Arthur offered a thin, mocking smile. "I need you to find her. But given the harshness of the elements, I am resigned to the tragic reality that you will likely only find her remains." Harlan Caldwell, a lean man with a missing left eye and a mouth stained with tobacco juice, weighed the pouch in his hand. "And if we find her alive, Mr. Pendleton?" Arthur leaned forward, his eyes dead and flat. "You won't. Do we understand each other?" Boyd Caldwell grinned, revealing rotten teeth. "Crystal clear, boss." Back on Whisper Ridge, the crisp morning air shattered Gideon's peaceful routine. He had gone out at dawn to check his snare lines, walking the perimeter of his territory. A mile from the cabin, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He knelt in the snow. The storm had passed 2 days ago, leaving a pristine white canvas. Cutting through that canvas were fresh tracks. 2 horses, tied up in a thicket below the ridge. From there, 2 sets of heavy boots began the steep ascent on foot. They weren't meandering like lost travelers or hunters' tracking game. They were moving in a disciplined, tactical spread. They were flanking the ridge. Gideon's blood ran cold, then immediately burned hot. The war he had tried to leave behind had just marched onto his mountain. He sprinted back to the cabin, bursting through the door. Abigail dropped the tin plate she was washing, startled by the sudden violence of his entry. "Gideon? What is it?" Gideon didn't answer immediately. He strode to the wall, pulling down a heavy gun belt and buckling it around his waist. He slid a terrifyingly large Bowie knife into his boot and grabbed his Winchester, stuffing his coat pockets with extra ammunition. His gentle demeanor was entirely gone, replaced by the grim, stone-faced visage of a soldier preparing for a slaughter. He looked at Abigail, his dark eyes fierce and uncompromising. Arthur didn't trust the mountain to finish the job. "We've got company coming up the ridge." He racked the lever of the rifle, chambering around with a loud, metallic clack. "Get in the root cellar beneath the floorboards, Abigail. And whatever you hear, do not make a sound. I swore to protect you, and I intend to keep that vow." The air on Whisper Ridge was utterly still, the kind of absolute, suffocating silence that precedes sudden violence. Gideon Cole slipped through the heavy timber with the practiced, terrifying grace of an apex predator. The thick elk-hide boots he wore made no sound against the packed powder. He breathed in shallow, measured rhythms, letting the freezing air fill his lungs while his eyes scanned the tree line. Below, Harlan and Boyd Caldwell were advancing. These were not mere thugs. They were seasoned manhunters, men who had tracked runaway outlaws through the Dakota Badlands and collected bounties in blood. Boyd Caldwell moved to the east, his lever-action rifle held high, using the massive trunks of the ponderosa pines for cover. Harlan took the western flank, his movements sharper, more deliberate. They were attempting a classic pincer maneuver, aiming to trap Gideon at the cabin door. But Gideon was a veteran of the bloodiest engagements of the Civil War. He did not wait to be besieged. He became the forest. At 70 yards, Boyd made a fatal error. He stepped onto a patch of ice concealed beneath a thin layer of fresh snow. His heavy leather boots slipped, and for a fraction of a second, his balance faltered, causing his rifle barrel to dip. It was the only opening Gideon needed. Rising from a snowdrift like a vengeful phantom, Gideon shouldered his Winchester 1873. The crack of the rifle was deafening, echoing violently off the granite peaks. The heavy-caliber bullet struck Boyd squarely in the chest, lifting the man off his feet and throwing him backward into a snowbank. He did not move again. "Boyd!" Harlan screamed, abandoning his stealth. Enraged, the older Caldwell brother opened fire blindly into the trees. Bark splintered and snow exploded around Gideon as he ducked behind a massive fallen cedar. Harlan was advancing rapidly now, fanning the hammer of a Colt single-action army revolver, sending a hail of lead into the brush. One of the heavy slugs caught Gideon's left shoulder, tearing through the bear hide coat and biting deep into his flesh. A grunt of raw pain escaped Gideon's lips as the impact spun him around, dropping him to one knee. His left arm went instantly numb, blood rapidly soaking the thick wool of his shirt. Seizing the advantage, Harlan rushed forward, his eyes burning with a sadistic triumph. He kicked Gideon's rifle away into the snow and aimed the smoking barrel of his Colt directly at Gideon's forehead. "Arthur Pendleton sends his regards." "Mountain Man," Harlan spat, his finger tightening on the trigger. But Harlan had forgotten about the cabin. A sudden, deafening blast shattered the timberline. Harlan staggered forward, his eyes wide with shock, before collapsing face first into the snow. Behind him stood Abigail Prescott. She was shivering violently, clad only in Gideon's oversized sweater, but her grip on a heavy double-barreled shotgun was absolute. The recoil had bruised her shoulder and knocked her back a step, but her jaw was set with an iron resolve. She had refused to stay in the root cellar. She had refused to be a victim again. Gideon stared at her, stunned, clutching his bleeding shoulder. The delicate high society heiress had just saved his life, stepping into the brutal reality of the frontier with unflinching courage. Are you all right?" Abigail gasped, dropping the heavy weapon as the adrenaline began to fade, her knees shaking as she rushed to his side. "I'll live," Gideon growled, forcing a pained smile as he let her help him to his feet. "You're a brave woman, Abigail Prescott." Back inside the cabin, the atmosphere shifted from the frantic energy of survival to a quiet, profound intimacy. Abigail worked with steady hands, tearing strips of clean linen and boiling snow water to clean Gideon's wound. The bullet had passed cleanly through the muscle, missing the bone. As she stitched the torn flesh, her fingers lingered on the extensive scarring across his powerful back, a roadmap of a painful past he rarely spoke of. Gideon watched her face in the firelight. He saw the transformation in her. The pampered girl from San Francisco was gone, replaced by a fierce, resilient woman. "You didn't have to come out there," Gideon said softly, his deep voice vibrating in the quiet cabin. "You could have hidden, waited, and let the only man who has ever truly protected me die." Abigail met his gaze, her eyes fierce and remarkably tender. "I'm done hiding, Gideon. From Arthur, from my fears, from all of it." The air between them grew thick, charged with an unspoken understanding. Gideon reached out with his uninjured arm, gently brushing a stray lock of hair from her cheek. His touch was incredibly gentle for a man of his size. Abigail leaned into his massive hand, closing her eyes. In that fleeting moment, amidst the blood and the bitter cold, a profound romance took root, one forged in the crucible of survival, bound by absolute trust. But their peace was strictly temporary. While searching Harlan Caldwell's pockets for extra ammunition, Gideon found a crumpled telegraph wire dispatched from Wallace. He brought it to the table, flattening the yellow paper beneath a lantern. It was addressed to Harlan, signed by Arthur. "Judge Richard Morgan has agreed to convene a special tribunal this Friday. Upon your confirmation of her demise, the death certificate will be signed, and the transfer of the Prescott Mining Company deeds to the Chicago Syndicate will be finalized by noon. Do not fail me." Abigail's blood ran cold. "Judge Morgan, he's the chief magistrate of the territorial court. If he signs that order, Arthur legally steals my father's empire, and my father will be ruined." Gideon looked at the clock on the mantel, It was Thursday evening. Wallace was a grueling, treacherous 15-mile ride down the mountain. "Then we don't let him sign it," Gideon stated, his eyes hardening into dark chips of flint. He began packing his saddlebags with agonizing determination, ignoring the sharp pain in his shoulder. "We ride for Wallace tonight." The descent from Whisper Ridge was a grueling ordeal against the elements. A fresh blizzard had swept over the Bitterroots, reducing visibility to a few meager feet. Gideon and Abigail shared his massive black draft horse, Samson, relying on the animal's brute strength and Gideon's uncanny knowledge of the terrain to navigate the perilous switchbacks. Abigail rode in front, shielded from the biting wind by Gideon's massive chest, his arms wrapped securely around her to hold the reins. Despite the freezing cold, the heat radiating from him kept her anchored, giving her the strength to endure the harrowing journey. By mid-morning on Friday, the booming mining town of Wallace emerged from the fog. It was a rugged, muddy settlement, a chaotic mixture of raw wealth and desperate poverty. The streets were packed with miners, prospectors, and opportunistic businessmen. In the center of town stood the majestic brick facade of the Bank of Wallace, where the territorial magistrate often held high-profile civil proceedings. Inside the bank's opulent mahogany boardroom, the atmosphere was entirely different. Arthur Pendleton stood at the head of a polished table, dressed in an immaculate charcoal suit. He was holding a handkerchief to his eyes, playing the role of the grieving fiancé with sickening perfection. Seated around the table were several powerful men, including the notoriously corrupt Judge Richard Morgan and Josiah Higgins, the bank's president. In the corner stood representatives of the ruthless Chicago Syndicate, eager to secure their new silver empire. "It is a tragedy beyond words," Arthur proclaimed, his voice trembling with manufactured sorrow. "My dear Abigail was taken by the unforgiving mountain. I have sent the finest trackers, but the storm was merciless. In accordance with her father's wishes, and to preserve the future of the Prescott Mining Company, I am prepared to execute the transfer of assets, ensuring her legacy lives on." Judge Morgan adjusted his spectacles, tapping a gold pen against a stack of official documents. "A terrible loss, Mr. Pendleton. The court extends its deepest sympathies. If you will just sign here, I will authorize the death certificate and the deed transfer." Arthur reached for the pen, a triumphant smirk breaking through his facade. He had won. The empire was his. Crash. The heavy double doors of the boardroom were kicked open with such explosive force that the brass hinges groaned and snapped. The room erupted in chaos as the wealthy businessmen jumped from their chairs. Standing in the doorway was a nightmare plucked from the mountain snows. Gideon Cole, covered in frost, his bare hide coat stained with dried blood, held his Winchester rifle resting casually, yet lethally, against his hip. He looked like a primal god of vengeance. And stepping out from behind his massive frame, looking pale but remarkably alive, was Abigail Prescott. Arthur's face drained of all color. The pen slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering onto the polished wood. "Abigail?" he whispered, his voice cracking in sheer, unadulterated terror. You're dead. I saw you. You left me to die, Arthur," Abigail corrected, her voice ringing out clear and commanding, cutting through the stunned silence of the room. She walked forward, her chin held high, no longer the naive girl he had manipulated, but a woman forged in the fires of the Bitterroots. "But the mountain didn't want me, and neither did you." The representatives from the Chicago Syndicate immediately backed away, sensing the catastrophic legal and physical danger. Judge Morgan stammered, attempting to shuffle the forged documents under a blotter. "What is the meaning of this? This is a closed legal proceeding." "This is a fraud, Judge Morgan," Abigail declared, slamming her hand onto the table. "Arthur Pendleton embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars from the Prescott Mining Company. When I discovered the forged ledgers in his private satchel, he attempted to murder me on the mountain pass to cover his tracks and hand my family's legacy to the syndicate." Arthur's eyes darted frantically. He looked at the two armed guards standing near the vault. "Kill him!" Arthur shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at Gideon. "He's a wild man! He kidnapped her!" The guards hesitated, their hands hovering over their holsters. Gideon didn't raise his rifle, he merely shifted his stance, his dark, scarred face radiating an aura of lethal promise. "The first man to clear leather won't live to hear the hammer drop," Gideon rumbled, his voice dropping an octave, shaking the very glass in the windows. The guards, recognizing the cold, dead eyes of a killer who had seen far worse than them, slowly raised their hands and stepped back. Realizing his meticulously built empire was crumbling into dust, Arthur let out a desperate cry. He reached into his coat and drew a silver-plated Remington Derringer, aiming it frantically at Abigail's chest. He never got to pull the trigger. Gideon moved with a speed that defied his massive size. In a blur of motion, he drew his heavy Bowie knife and hurled it across the room. The massive blade buried itself deep into the mahogany table, passing straight through the sleeve of Arthur's suit jacket, pinning his wrist to the wood. Arthur screamed in agony, dropping the Derringer as his bones cracked under the sheer force of the impact. The boardroom doors burst open again, this time revealing U.S. Marshal Fred Dubois, accompanied by 3 armed deputies. They had been tipped off by a telegram Abigail and Gideon forced the telegraph operator to send before entering the bank. "Arthur Pendleton," Marshal Dubois announced, stepping into the room with his hand resting on his Colt. "You are under arrest for grand larceny, fraud, and the attempted murder of Miss Abigail Prescott. Judge Morgan, you'd best step away from those papers before I arrest you for conspiracy." Arthur collapsed to his knees, sobbing, his wrist still pinned to the table, his grand ambitions utterly destroyed by the woman he had underestimated and the mountain man he had never known existed. As the deputies dragged Arthur away, and the corrupt officials scrambled to save themselves, Abigail turned to Gideon. The giant stood quietly near the doorway, watching her with a mixture of pride and profound sorrow. In his mind, his task was done. He had protected her, delivered her back to her world of wealth and safety. He didn't belong in parlors or boardrooms. He belonged to the pines, the snow, and the quiet isolation